Hello. It is good to see you. Every week we start the same way. We say hello to our different campuses. So if you're hanging out with us in Racine, hi to you. Kenosha, hello. To those of you watching on your computers, on your phones, maybe on your television screens, you're part of our online crew, hello to you. And then to all the people in the room with me. If you are single, ladies and gentlemen, this is the place to be. I'm looking around and I'm like, this is like Match.com right here. These are beautiful people in the room today. So here's the deal. We are launching right now a brand new series that we'll be in for the next 3 weeks called I Love My Church. And the purpose of this series is to revisit why we started Great Lakes Church, to refocus ourselves as a church, and to ensure that we're all moving in the same direction. All right, now here's the deal. In my opinion, this is the most important series we do every year. We try to be creative and add different elements and add different maybe phrases or points. But at the end of the day, every single year, we do this series in some way, shape, or form because it is so important that we do not lose sight of why we started. It's so important we're moving all in the same direction and we're going forward. But that being said, I'm confident that of all the years we've done that, this is the most important year we've ever done it. And the reason I say that isn't for like hype or anything like that. It's just because the church has changed over the last year. With COVID-19, with many people watching online now, with us really having a lot of ambiguity of when we're going to be in services, we've had to remind ourselves the church actually isn't just about services. It's good we have these things, right? But the church isn't even about a facility. It's not about a building. It's so much more than that. And so I'm going to let you know right up front, we are not going to read a bunch of Bible verses today. We're going to read some, but the purpose of today, the focus of today is just to make sure we're all on the same page to revisit who we are as a church and why we exist. All right, so this is going to be like a crash course, and I'm your professor. Yeah, I'll give you the big idea right up front. Here it is. We're not here to make a point. We're here to make a difference. We're not here to make a point. We're here to make a difference. Someone asked me earlier, well, who exactly is this series for? And I said, well, really, it's for anybody who considers Great Lakes Church their church. So if you think of this place not as Dave's church, you think of this as like my church when you're thinking about it, then this series is for you. However, if you are new to Great Lakes and you're kind of sitting back and you're like, I think this might be my church. If you don't get too intense today and you don't lose your mind, Dave, and your eyes don't bug out too much, I think this might be my church. And I'll say it's also a series for you because like I said, we're talking about who we are as a church. And not only are we talking about it, but I'm going to invite you over the next 3 weeks to be a part of it. So to kick us off, I'm going to ask 3 very specific questions. Here we go. Number 1, when you think of your dream car, what comes to your mind? Now, no need to yell out loud. I suppose if you're at home, you can yell at the computer. But when you think of your dream car, what comes to your mind? For some of you, it's going to be a sports car. It's going to be a Lamborghini. It's going to be a Ferrari, right? It's going to be a high-level type of car. Others of you, it's going to be a classic car. You're going to go back to the 50s or the 60s, and that's going to be your jam. If you are a new parent, it might be a minivan. Hey, you're just happy? You're just happy to have something practical, right? Maybe for you, you're like, I don't care as long as it's paid off. We all have different images that come to our mind when we think of our dream car. Now, I'm going to ask you a second question. When you think of your dream vacation, what comes to your mind? For some, it's going to be a cabin in the mountains, right? This is where you would like to vacation. In fact, just a couple days ago, I was in the great state of Montana. That is my type of vacation. But for others of you, it's going to be like a house on the beach, right? You're going to need the water. You're going to need the sand. That is your ideal vacation. If you're a single parent, maybe it's just going to the grocery store without your kids. Like you're like, hey, I'm absolutely cool with that, right? But we all have different images that come to our mind. Now I'm going to ask you a third question. When you think of your dream church, what comes to your mind? Now, I know this sounds crazy, okay? I'll admit this, but when I was a teenager, I actually thought about this kind of stuff, right? I wasn't into sports. I wasn't into cars. I know it sounds weird. I wasn't that much into girls. They were definitely into me, but it just wasn't my thing at that time, right? I was totally into church. Like I had this thing in me, I was obsessed, always trying to think like, what should church be like and look like? And it was always this sanitary picture of what a church should be. So I had this idea that, everybody should, be Republican, right? They should all vote for the same candidate. This was 16 years old, I'm thinking like this. It should be a church where nobody voices any doubts or has any questions because we have such deep faith in God. Everybody is certain about their beliefs. Everybody just has their act together, right? There's nobody with big addictions or ongoing struggles because God has set them free. It would be a church where everybody, of course, is heterosexual. Nobody's divorced. There's married couples and they all have 2.5 kids. So the dream church for me when I was like 16 years old is something out of a Hallmark movie. That is literally how I thought, as crazy as it was, until I actually became part of churches like that. Until I was actually a part of churches that looked sanitary every direction you would look at it. And it looked like they had their act together. And then you get behind the scenes, and you're like, yeah, this is a little bit messier than most people want to acknowledge. And what I learned about being part of churches like that is there was always this us versus them mentality. We've got the answer to all of life, and they need the answer. Right? That's how it was. It was us versus them. And then it was like this thing about like, if you smoked, you were going to hell. Now, I don't believe that. You do smell like you've been there, but, that's how it is, right? Alcohol, right? If you drank alcohol, that was wrong. It was a sin. And we've said before, right? When somebody asked me, is it a sin to drink beer? I'm like, it is to drink light beer. That's probably not the best thing. But here's the deal. That's how church was. And in the churches that I was a part of, they would hand out voter guides at this time of year. It was always really passive aggressive telling you to vote for a specific candidate who was what party? Republican Party, yeah. And then I was part of churches that protested abortion clinics, literally stood outside with signs picketing them. I was a part of a church where the lead pastor during music one time walked off the stage to a first-time guest, first time they were ever there, took the guy's hat off and handed it to them. Because we don't do that in the house of the Lord, right? And so that's the picture that I had in my mind that I want to be a part of a church like this. Then I became part of a church like this, and I'm like, oh, no, I do not want to be a part of this anymore. And so in my late teens and early 20s, this picture started to change. This idea of what a dream church should be started to evolve. And then I started hearing different phrases that really resonated with me. Phrases like no perfect people allowed and come as you are. And church for people who don't like church. And a church where it's okay to not be okay. And church for the rest of us. And so starting somewhere in my mid-20s and over the course of several years, a passion started to grow inside of me to start a new church. And yet every time that I took the step out to do it, and there were multiple times where this happened, where I'd meet with people, or I'd email people, and I'd share the vision, and people would get all excited, I would chicken out. I just got really, really afraid. And then in the summer of 2008, through a series of just different events, my wife and I decided it is finally time. We are going to do this thing. We're going to start a church in my hometown of Kenosha, Wisconsin. So we were in Seattle at the time, and I stood in front of the church where I was on staff, and I said to the church, here's the deal. We've thought about this. We've talked about this. I've always chickened out. I've been so afraid, but now is the moment. I'm walking into my fear. Now, some of you may have heard this before. But what I want to do is take a couple of minutes to listen to some audio from that talk. And just to make it interesting, we've added some pictures from the last 12 years of our church. And maybe you've heard, like I said, maybe you've heard this before, but I think it's so important for us to hear. This is the last talk that I gave to the church I was at in Seattle. Check this out. Starting a church is filled with a lot of unknowns. It is filled with a lot of fears. There's a lot of insecurities. Once I told Ryan, hey, this is it. We're out in 30 days. I couldn't sleep for 2 nights. I went a whole week without pretty much eating anything. I now know why Pastor Ryan is so skinny and why he cries all the time. The guy started a church. And so I have all these questions going through my mind right now. Where are we going to meet? How are we going to have the money to do this? Who's going to be on the launch team? All of these things going through my mind. How are we going to do music? How are we going to pull this off? Is a church like this going to work in Kenosha? And I constantly evaluate my ability to do this. Dear God,
I'm not talented enough. I'm not educated enough. I mean, we could go through the list. I just have all of these fears that are consuming me. And the natural thing that I do, and I'm sure that you do as well, is we begin to stereotype the type of individual God uses. We begin to say, well, the type of individual that God uses obviously is going to have talents. They're going to have all this charisma and personality and leadership ability. They're going to be organized. They're going to be able to kind of do it all because they're going to be the leader. But then you look in the Bible. I mean, pick any story, pick any character in the Bible that you admire, that you're like, man, that is a person of faith. That is a person that I admire. And every one of them, without exception, we're plagued with fear. I'm going to move forward regardless of the fear. I'm not going to let fear hold me back. I'm starting a church because I do not want to become accustomed to saying yes to fear and no to God. And someday I will stand in front of a church and I'll be able to look at the thousands of lives that have been impacted because of the people that came together. And I'm going to be able to see in our group marriages that have been restored. And I'm going to be able to see at Great Lakes Church people who said, I used to be turned off to God, but now I'm excited about him. I believe that day's coming. I believe it's coming because this is not going to be another missed opportunity.
So we started the church and thanks. We did, man. We started it and things took off pretty quickly. September of 2008, I meet with this small group of family and friends and I share the vision with them. And a lot of them say, Dave, we're in. A month later, we're holding a practice service. And then we hold one practice service a month. And then in February of 2009, we officially launch. And Great Lakes Church takes off. And then over the next several years, we had service times, we had auditoriums, and we had campuses. And over the past 12 years, we've met in 17 different locations for our Sunday morning services and Wednesday evening services and special events. It has been a wild ride. And there's a couple thousand people in Southeast Wisconsin who now say, Great Lakes Church is my church. And the question that I've been asked more than any other in regards to starting a new church is why a new church? I mean, come on, there's a couple hundred churches in Kenosha and Racine area. Why not join them? Why not just be a part of something that already exists? And I think that's a very legit question. And it's legit because when you break it down, every church is really called to do the same thing. 3 things. Every church is supposed to do the same 3 things. Love God, love people, and make disciples. That is it. Love God, love people, and make disciples. Now, love God, it's pretty self-explanatory. Love people. Pretty self-explanatory. Make disciples, that can get a little ambiguous, so let me define for you what a disciple is, just so we're all on the same page and we all know what we're trying to do. A disciple is someone who's actively following Jesus, being changed by Jesus, loving like Jesus, and helping others do the same. So the mission of every church, doesn't matter where you go, love God, love people, make disciples. We all say it differently. We all come up with creative phrases to make it kind of our own, but the mission is the same. Now, if you want to know how does Great Lakes Church kind of put that in terms, here it is. People helping people find and follow Jesus. Well, what does it mean to find and follow Jesus? It means to love God, love people, and make disciples. Of course, the follow-up question then is, well, if every church has the same mission, why are there so many of them? Why do they all look different? And the answer to that question is different churches are needed to reach different people. Right? Based on your personality, based on your background, based on maybe what you've seen in life and how it's shaped you, you're not going to connect with every church out there. So we need different churches because when you think about it, every church has a unique identity. Every church does. It's unavoidable. Every church is going to be a reflection of the pastor and the background of the pastor. It's going to be a reflection of those who are in leadership. It's going to be a reflection of the culture in which that church exists. It's going to be a reflection of the community in which that church is located. Now, if you just think about this, right? Would this church look different if I was 21 years old? Heck yes, it would. Right? I'd be doing TikTok videos all the time from the stage. Would it look different if I was 86 years old? Yes, we'd still be selling cassette tapes in the lobby of the talks. It just would look very different. Would it look different if we were in an urban area with a lot of people in the area, a heavy population? Of course it would. Would it look different if we were in a remote town in northern Wisconsin, 600 people in the town, and everybody loves to hunt and fish? Yes, yes, yes. It would look very different. Would it look different if I was crazy passionate about politics? Yes, I'm not crazy passionate about politics, but it would look different if I was. And so every church has a unique identity. And then based on that identity, you naturally draw and attract certain people. Some churches are accidental and they're unintentional in their identity. Other churches happen to be intentional. Right? We see this in business all the time. Right? A business starts, they have a certain audience that they're going after. Now, other people will show up, but primarily that audience is going to show up. So who do you think is the primary target for McDonald's? Yeah, kids, teenagers, young families, and college students. Now, it doesn't mean that you're not going to swing by and get yourself a Big Mac later today, right? But it does mean that primarily that is who they're going after. How about Nordstrom's? Oh, I'm going to tell you who it is because I looked it up. The average customer at Nordstrom's is 43 years old with an annual income of almost $300,000. This is why I shop at Nordstrom Rack. Nordstrom Rack was made for me, right? And then let me ask you for Cabela's, who do they attract? It's not the soccer mom, right? It's not the tech. I can't wait to go to Cabela's. No, it's those who love to hunt and fish and chew tobacco. That's their audience. How about Forever 21? Yeah, it's millennials. My dad is not shopping at Forever 21. My grandma is not shopping there. Different churches are necessary to reach different people. And so every church is going to have their own identity. I'm going to say it again. That happens accidentally or it happens purposely. It's intentional or it's unintentional. And at Great Lakes Church on day one, we decided to be intentional about it. And so we just say it outright. Great Lakes Church was started for people who do not go to church. Now, I know a lot of you have a church background. I'd say about 50% from the studies we've done, about 50% of the people who show up do not have a church background or haven't been to church in 10 years or longer, but I know half of you do. And that's totally okay. But we started for the 70% of people in Southeast Wisconsin who are not connected to a faith family. We started for people who would say, I'm disinterested in God. We started for people who couldn't care less about God or consider themselves far from God, which if you think about it, is problematic. That's like starting a Chinese restaurant for people who do not like Chinese food. Right? It's like starting a coffee shop for people who say, I don't like coffee. It doesn't even sound rational. But when Jesus started the church 2,000 years ago, he did not start it for people with a common set of beliefs. He did not start it for people with a common interest. He started it for people with a common problem. And the problem was they did not know where they stood with God. The problem was they didn't know how God felt about them. They didn't know if God was personal. The problem was they had doubts and they had questions. The problem was they weren't living as perfectly as they wanted to live. The problem was their only idea about God was out to get them, and if they did something wrong, God was going to zap them with lightning. Even religious leaders thought this way, which is why on several occasions, religious leaders approached Jesus and they confronted him for spending time with non-religious people. And in one instance, when he's confronted, here's how he responds. He says, healthy people don't need a doctor. Sick people do. I have come to call not those who think they are righteous, but those who know they are sinners. That's offensive. I mean, seriously, think about it. Jesus says, I came for spiritually sick people. But what he's saying is not meant to be offensive. Jesus is saying, hey, listen, you can be a great dad. You can be an engaged husband, engaged wife. You can be responsible financially. You get tons of money in your bank account. Like you can have your act together and still be spiritually sick. And so in 2009, when we officially launched Great Lakes Church, we wanted to be clear that Great Lakes Church is a hospital for sinners, not a hotel for saints. Right? That's what we are. We're a hospital for sinners. Every one of us are broken. And that is why we exist. We are a church for broken people. And of course, the argument and the pushback can easily be, well, come on, if people are broken and their lives are messy, they don't want to show up to a church. They don't want to be a part of a faith family, whether online or in person. And I would say I totally disagree. And the reason I disagree is I have seen it over and over and over that when people go through difficulty in life, when they experience tragedy and loss, when people experience fear in life, when their lives are the most broken, that is when most people, not everybody, but most people run to God, not from God. The problem is when they try to connect with a local church and they have the courage to finally show up to a physical location for a weekly service, it's pretty clear this is an insider club. It's obvious that the church is for church people. Now, the good news for all of us is that we are not the first generation of Jesus followers to struggle with this. And so my favorite story to revisit in the Bible is found in the book of Acts. This is something we revisit on an annual basis, right? 15 years after the resurrection of Jesus, most of the people who were following Jesus were Jews. Okay, that was their background. They'd grown up going to temple and memorizing the ancient scriptures. And these former Jews, what they were doing as followers of Jesus is they were taking their customs, their traditions, their Jewish holidays, their way of thinking, and then they were forcing it on everyone who wanted to follow Jesus, including non-Jews, who were known as Gentiles. And so you wanted to become a follower of Jesus, but you weren't Jewish? Here's what would happen. The Jewish people would expect you to follow their dietary restrictions. They would expect you to follow their Jewish holidays and customs. If you were a man, they expected you to be circumcised. So they'd send you down to Great Clips. You'd get a little trim, a little snippy snip, and you could be part of their club, right? They wanted a church where everybody thought and looked and acted alike. And it became such a source of tension in the early church that eventually a meeting was called. It was a big deal. It was the first business meeting in the history of the church. And the people who attended were really, really important. Peter, one of the disciples of Jesus, a leader in the early church, he was there. James, the brother of Jesus, another great leader in the early church, he was there. The Apostle Paul, I mean, he wrote so many letters that ended up in our Bible, just influential in the early days of the church. He was there. If I remember right, Kanye, the Kardashian girls, they were there as well. This was a really, really big deal. And the question that everyone was wrestling with is, who is the church for? Is it for church people? Is it for people who are disciplined and have their act together and have very few questions and are willing to follow all of the ancient Jewish laws? Or is it for people who struggle and have questions and doubts and regrets? Who is the church for? And right at the start of the meeting, there were heated arguments taking place and there's debates taking place about what should be expected from people once they decide to become followers of Jesus. And this isn't going to surprise you. Some of the very first people to step up and speak are the Jewish leaders because they're the ones in charge. And they presented a case that since most of the people following Jesus are former Jews, everyone should be expected to follow their customs and their traditions. And the bottom line is they were really, really afraid that if they didn't have high expectations and they didn't have lots of rules and structure, that things would get messy and things would get out of hand very quickly. And so there's a lot of debating and a lot of arguing, but eventually, James, this brother of Jesus, one of the key leaders in the church in Jerusalem, he stands up. And what he says is a summary of why we're here today. It is the reason Great Lakes Church exists. James says, I've heard your arguments. I've listened to both sides. I've watched you debate. And then he says this, it is my judgment, after hearing all of these things, that we should not make it difficult for those who are turning to God. Do not miss this. James says the church, every church, our church, this church should be characterized by an environment and a culture and an atmosphere and a spirit that says we're going to do everything we can to remove the hurdles that keep people from connecting with God. And then James spends the next few minutes challenging his Jewish friends to give up their preferences so that anyone who wants to connect with God would not experience a bunch of hurdles in the process. And so ultimately what happens is at the end of the meeting, and there's still a little bit of debates that go on, a letter is written up and it's distributed to local churches. And the message is pretty simple. Let's not make it difficult for people who are turning to God. Now, I wish I could say after that business meeting, everything turned out happily ever after. But if you know anything about history, it did not. There have been so many defining moments in the history of the church where followers of Jesus, through their words, through their actions, they've actually made it difficult to follow Jesus. 1,000 years ago, there were wars initiated by church leaders who wanted to reclaim real estate. In the Middle Ages, people were tortured by church leaders for all sorts of ridiculous reasons. In our own country, we have religious leaders that try to convince people if they're truly followers of Jesus, they're going to vote for a certain candidate. There is this gravitational pull in every single one of us to set up rules and expectations and structure for people if they want to be a real Christian. There's something about us as humans, once we're on the inside, we want to make it very exclusive. Right? If you get a backstage pass to meet a celebrity, you want to get backstage and find out there's only 5 people back there versus 5,000. You want it exclusive. This past week when I flew to Montana, Delta upgraded me to Delta Preferred. So I got more seat. Nobody sitting next to me. In fact, most of the Delta Preferred was empty. There were a lot of people in the back of the plane, losers, right? They were all back there, and I'm sitting there enjoying myself. Well, I flew with a buddy of mine. And so he was in the back. He didn't get upgraded. So I texted him, and I said, God's favor is upon me. Favor ain't fair, buddy. And so that's what I texted him, and then we get off the plane, and I looked at him and said, favor ain't fair. Favor ain't fair, right? I was just kind of giving him a hard time. But this is us as humans. We like exclusivity. We like how we feel. We like having a membership to something other people don't have a membership to. And so I need you to hear this. The responsibility of every church, the responsibility of our church is to make the message of God's grace accessible to everyone. This is the reason why a couple times a year I just get away for a few days and I just wrestle with the question, are we doing anything, whether it's intentional or unintentional, are we doing anything that makes it difficult for people who are turning to God? And the analogy that we've used from the earliest days of our church is this analogy of a ladder without rungs. And we have a ladder that we bring on stage. Maybe I'll do it in the coming weeks of this series, but it's this ladder here and it has absolutely no rungs. And what we talk about is how there are different people who show up to the church, they walk through our doors, and they come for different reasons. Maybe they're going through tragedy in their life or transition in life. Maybe they're just curious, right? Maybe something's happening in their parenting, but they show up. And when they show up, often, all they see is a group of people who look like they have their lives together, people who look like they're at the top of the spiritual ladder. Now, believe me, I know you ain't got your act together. But they think you do, right? They think, wow, look at these people. Look how passionate they are when they sing. Man, when Dave gives a talk, look at they nod. Some of them take notes. Man, this is so, like these people love Jesus. They seem to have everything together, and that's just not me. And depending on what season they're in, sometimes those same people think, well, I'd like to join a group of people like that. I'd like to be a part of people like that, but I'm not that spiritual. I can't sing like them. I don't know the songs. I don't know how this whole church thing works. I don't know how to pray like them. The only prayer that I know is, now I lay me down to sleep, a pint of vodka at my feet. If I should die before I wake, tell my friends I drank it straight. Like that's the prayer that I know, right? The only Bible study I know is Adam and Eve were naked. Right? That's the extent. And I've got doubts and I've got questions, and nobody here looks like they have any doubts. Aren't there any rungs? Aren't there any places that I can start? Because I can't just jump up to where they're at. Now, we know that there's really no spiritual ladder. We know that there's really no level of, hey, that person's way more into, higher with God than I. But this is how we think as humans. And the message that the church communicates over and over and over with our attitudes and our songs and the teaching and the way we interact with people is, sorry, this is a church for church people. And so from the moments we opened our doors, we wrestled with the question, how can we put rungs on the ladder? The second message I gave at Great Lakes Church was this message. How can we make the message of Jesus accessible to everyone? And so the first ladder, for the first rung that we put on the ladder, we don't have some image that's going to come up, but here it is. It's this thing called grace. Grace is the starting point for everything we do. It is the foundation of everything we teach. Grace is unmerited, unearned, and undeserved kindness. So from day one, we said if we're going to create a church for the 70% of the people who don't go to church, we're going to show people respect. whether or not they deserve respect. We're going to be kind whether or not the person deserves kindness. We're going to show love whether or not that person deserves to be loved. We're going to be generous to someone who we might even feel has taken a little bit advantage of us. We are going to be a church of grace. This past week, I had an individual open up about some of the brokenness of their life and some of the destructive decisions that they're making. And they asked this question. They said, Dave, I know you talk about heaven and hell and eternity, and you do that from time, but why don't you talk about hell more? Why don't you say something that scares me from the decisions that I'm making? And as they're talking, it's reminding me of this play that used to come to the church that I grew up in on an annual basis. It was called Heaven's Gates and Hell's Flames. And it was this play that would have this really cheesy set, and it would be really bad acting, but man, we tried to scare people. If you're like, I have no clue, Dave, you've got a weird church background, good news for you, I've got 30 seconds to show you. Check this out.
No. Throw them into the pits of hell. Throw them into hell.
Whoa. Right, so he asked me, he says, Dave, why don't we just focus on hell more? And the answer I gave was something that the Apostle Paul wrote a couple thousand years ago to followers of Jesus living in Rome. He said, the kindness of God is intended to turn you from your sin. It is the love of God that ultimately changes us. It is the patience of God that ultimately changes us. It is the mercy of God that ultimately changes us. And if you haven't figured it out yet, love is always greater than fear. I don't want my wife married to me because she's afraid of being lonely. I want her married to me because she loves me. I don't want, I was afraid of being single. I was afraid that I wasn't going to be able to pay my bills, so I'm married to you. Love is always greater than fear. And if we're going to continue to be a church where people who don't go to church feel like they have a safe place to explore the claims of Jesus and to take next steps in their spiritual journey, we just have to be a place of grace. Grace is giving someone what they do not deserve. And this is exactly what our Heavenly Father has done for us. And if I do not see that, if I do not understand that, if I do not realize how broken I am in my need for God's grace, I will never truly be able to give grace to others. And here's why. Because whatever kindness I give to someone else, whatever bit of respect I show someone, whatever bit of honor I give someone, it's always going to come from a place of superiority. You need this because you're broken, but I'm not that broken. You need God's grace, but I'm pretty good. Grace is what keeps me from elevating myself above other people. And it keeps me from placing labels on people. Grace reminds me that the most important thing is not what I've done for Jesus, but what he's done for me. Grace is what gives me the courage to acknowledge my weakness. And when you boil it down, grace is the choice to love everybody always, which is why we use that phrase all the time around here. Love everybody always. It's choosing to be patient with people who are absolutely inconsistent in their faith. It's choosing to accept those who want to do better, but they keep falling short. It's choosing to throw away the chalk and stop keeping score. It's choosing to confess my own sins rather than the sins of others. It's choosing to walk towards those that others walk away from. And I know that grace makes some of us really uncomfortable because it just seems too easy. And we want people to pay for the wrongs that they do, and we want people to feel the shame and the guilt. But I'm going to ask you a straightforward question. What do you think has made a mess of our world? Is it too much grace and too much forgiveness and too many people turning the other cheek? Or is it too much guilt and too much punishment and too much shame and too much retribution? I'm convinced that if grace is seen in every area of our church, if it's seen on every one of our volunteer teams, if it's seen in every one of our group discussions, if it's seen in every one of our social media posts, it will give people a safe place to take steps in their spiritual journey. Remember, we're not here to make a point. We are here to make a difference. And so there's lots of ways that we could structure and organize our church. There's lots of ways that we could put together our service orders. There's lots of different songs that we could pick. We could come up with a dress code if we wanted, but we are super strategic in the choices that we make because we align with the words of James when he said, "It is my judgment that we should not make it difficult for those who are turning to God." And so we're doing our best to build a church that makes it easy for people to connect with God. And the very first step to building a church like that is grace. And so I'm going to invite you. For some of you, I'm re-inviting you to help us build a church for the 70% of people in our area who do not attend church. Now, next week, we're going to get into a few more details of what that looks like. We're going to talk about a couple more rungs. But for now, I just want to challenge you to grow in grace, to continually be awed by the grace of God in your own life, and then do your best to show it to others. Let me close with this. Philip Yancey, in his book, Vanishing Grace, he references an ethos or a philosophy of a church out in the Denver area. And over the last several years, this ethos has become our ethos. This attitude, this philosophy has become our attitude and our philosophies. Here's what he writes. Married, divorced, or single here, it's one family that mingles here. Conservative or liberal here, we've all got to give a little here. Big or small here, there's room for us all here. Doubt or believe here, we all can receive here. Gay or straight here, there's no hate here. Woman or man here, everyone can serve here. Whatever your race here, for all of us grace here. In imitation of the ridiculous love Almighty God has for each of us and all of us, let us live in love without labels. Let me pray. Our Heavenly Father, this is your church. We're here to honor you, and we're here to connect with the 70% of people in our community who do not go to church anywhere. I pray, Heavenly Father, give us the wisdom on how to do that best and the courage to do it. In Jesus' name, amen.